Hello. If you want to skip the historical context and background to this matter and are mainly here to find out the answer to the question in the title, please skip to the outline section shown here, in which the actual proportion of Chinese loanwords within basic or core Vietnamese vocabulary will be shown.
Also note that tragically, my Mandarin is much worse than my Vietnamese, which is itself much worse than my English. So please forgive me for my bad Mandarin pronunciation. I am mainly studying Chinese for reading Chinese characters, so I haven't paid that much attention to pronunciation, which I apologize for. Moreover, I would like to make it clear that I will generally be using my own personal accent for the Vietnamese words. And I like to describe this accent as a weird Americanized version of a cultivated Quảng Nam Da Nang accent. I will use the standard accent at times, though, specifically when I think that it would be illustrative in comparing a Vietnamese word to its Chinese cognate.
That being said, let us proceed.
Throughout the years, the impact of Chinese influence on Vietnam has ranged from ethics, politics, clothing, and language as well, the last of which will be the subject of this video. Over a millennium of direct political control led to the infusion of several Chinese loanwords into Proto-Vedic and Proto-Viet Muong, the ancestral languages of what is now contemporary Vietnamese, with these words being known today as Chữ Hán or Hán Tự. In fact, even after direct political control by Imperial China ended in 938 AD, albeit not permanently because of the two-decade-long Ming occupation of the early 15th century, literary Chinese continued to be used by the political and cultural elite of Vietnamese society. It allowed people across the country to discuss various issues relating to Confucianism, Taoism, etc., and it enabled communications with scholars and officials from China, Japan, and Korea, the three countries and Vietnam forming what is currently known as the Sinosphere. Note that Vietnam was technically not the official name of the country until the advent of the Nguyen dynasty, because the Jiaqing Emperor of the Great Qing did not permit Emperor Yalam to use the name Nam Viet, so the Emperor Yalam had to just switch the two words, which is kind of funny, but regardless, literary Chinese was utilized until the 20th century, in which it was replaced in official capacity by Chữ Quốc ngữ, a Romance script created by Jesuit missionaries who are mainly Portuguese, and they made this script with what could be considered a 17th century Hanoi dialect in mind. Another writing system that Chữ Quốc ngữ replaced was Chữ Nom, which can be seen as the nativized system of Chinese characters used by Vietnamese writers, with this system mainly being used in a more vernacular context. For instance, the Tale of Kieu, known in Vietnamese as Chuyện Kieu, was written in Chữ Nom, and it is widely considered to be the masterpiece of Vietnamese literature. Many of the characters in Chữ Nom can be found within Chữ Hán, but many others were newly created and invented, having no counterparts in literary Chinese. Hence, a Chinese person who would attempt to read a Junom text would be absolutely confused. They may sense that something is off or fishy, or they may be gaslit into thinking that Junom is simply Chinese that is too advanced for their minds to comprehend, unlike the 900 IQ minds of Vietnamese scholars. Now, what are some examples of these loanwords? Well, the funny thing is that I've already used plenty of Chinese loanwords in this video. To start off, the word Nam in Vietnam is the Vietnamese reading of Nan, meaning south. Note that Nam actually has an additional meaning, that being masculine or male, and this is the Vietnamese reading of the character Nan. Meanwhile, the term Quốc ngữ means national language, with Quốc being the Vietnamese reading of Quốc and ngữ being the Vietnamese reading of Yu. Hence, Quốc ngữ is the Vietnamese pronunciation of Quốc yu, which is used by certain Chinese communities to refer to the modern Mandarin language. Note that Mandarin in Vietnamese is Tiếng Quang Thoại, with Quang Thoại being the Vietnamese reading of Quan Hoa, which literally translates to the speech of the Mandarins, Mandarins being the officials, government officials of Sinospheric states. As for the word chữ, it is one of the Vietnamese readings of zi, with the word tự also being a reading of that same character. Note that Vietnamese adds the meaning of writing system to chữ, which is where chữ Nôm and chữ Hán come from. And also note that while Nôm is a native word, Hang is the Vietnamese reading of Han, which is fitting to say the least. And as for the most famous epic of Vietnamese literature, that being Truyện Kiều, the word Truyện is a Vietnamese reading of the character Chuan, with other readings being Truyện, Truyện, and Truyện. Note that certain regional accents do not distinguish the TR and CH initials, so there may be only two readings of the character depending on what accent you speak, but honestly this issue is not that important considering that if you speak quickly, it is hard to distinguish these two initials anyways. And meanwhile, the word Kiu in the context of the poem is a reading of Qiao, although the Vietnamese meaning pertains more to the sense of looking upwards of hope, while the current Chinese meaning is related but not quite the same. Note that Kiu is also a reading of the character Qiao, with Kiu in this sense being used in the term Viet Kiu, for example, which refers to Vietnamese people living overseas. Last, but certainly not least, what about the most popular Vietnamese last name? Surely Nguyen, which is recognizably a Vietnamese surname and was the name of Vietnam's final imperial dynasty, must be a native word. Well, to the dismay of those who are Vietnamese and make not being Chinese their entire personality, the word Nguyen is the Vietnamese reading of Duẩn, which would be Duẩn in Mandarin and Yuan in Korean. There are a few Chinese people with this last name, but this number absolutely pales in comparison to the number of Vietnamese people with the last name Nguyen. In fact, similar to Korean, most Vietnamese names and surnames are borrowed from Chinese. Let us use the most famous Vietnamese figure of the 20th century to illustrate this point, the founder of the Viet Minh and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam.
The full name Ho Chi Minh, or in the standard accent Ho Chi Minh, would actually be the Vietnamese reading of Hu Zhi Ming. But what about his birth name? As for his birth name, it was Nguyễn Sinh Cung or Nguyễn Sinh Cung, the Vietnamese reading of Duẩn Sinh Cung, and his courtesy name was Nguyễn Tất Thành or Nguyễn Tất Thành in the standard accent, which would be the Vietnamese reading of Duẩn Bi Cheng.
With that being said, one can see that a lot of these words are used in a more serious or formal context. Indeed, most linguists have already observed that most Chinese loanwords were made in a literary or formal context, so words of a more formal register are more likely to be loanwords from Chinese with respect to Vietnamese. And this applies to the other Sino-Spheric languages, those being Japanese and Korean. But what about more basic everyday vocabulary? To answer this question, this video will use two corpora, or sets of words, a frequency list of a Vietnamese children's literature corpus, and a frequency list of Vietnamese movies/shows and their subtitles based on Open Subtitles data. For each of the words that we will consider, we will assign one of the following statuses. 1. Definitely from Chinese. 2. Probably from Chinese. 3. Possibly from Chinese. 4. At least has one meaning from Chinese. And lastly, most likely native or from another language entirely. Of course, we must explain what these categories actually mean. To do so, we'll start off with the first status, which is definitely. In this case, tonal form correspondences match. They have the same meaning, similar pronunciation, they have a shared use in compound terms, and the etymology is supported by many linguists. For probably, it is akin to definitely or similar to definitely, but perhaps the correspondence do not match fully or exactly, and there's not really a shared use in compound terms, which makes it more difficult to see whether it's actually from, Chinese, because if there were similar compounds, then that means we could eliminate the other possibility, which may be that it would be a native word. And this usually reflects the difference between Sino-Vietnamese versus non-Sino-Vietnamese, and uncertainty, on the simple fact that there is a lot of uncertainty over Old Chinese compared to Middle Chinese. So hence we are not as confident as we would be for words in the definitely category. Next we have possibly, which means that there are some similarities between the term and the Chinese counterpart, but the evidence for connection is somewhat sparse or unclear. And of course there are the native words, which will not be highlighted on the Google Docs I have listed below, or they may be for an entire language family entirely, which for which these terms do exist, and I'll probably point them out in the Google Docs and perhaps in this video. And lastly, there's a bit of an interesting category, which is a word which has at least one meaning that comes from Chinese. So what does this exactly mean? What I mean is that some words in Vietnamese have multiple meanings and they may have different etymologies. Therefore, one must look at each of the meanings and see where each of those meanings come from. Now, there being this category does raise an issue over whether or not it's fair to put two words with different amounts of borrowed meanings in the same category. So, for instance, let's say you have word A with 4 out of 5 meanings being native words or other native meanings, and then word B having 4 of its 5 meanings come from Chinese or another language. Is it really fair to put it all in one category? Hence, I made the decision to calculate the overall proportion actually of Chinese loanwords within Basic Vietnamese using a point system. And the point system goes as follows. So definitely would receive 1 point, probably would receive 0.75 points, possibly would receive 0.5 points, and each word with at least one meaning from Chinese would receive the points based on the number of meanings that come from Chinese divided by the total number of meanings. So for instance, if it had 6 meanings and 2 of them came from Chinese, then it would receive 0.33 points. And we would add up all these points for each of the terms and then divide them by 250, which would be the denominator or the total number of terms we were looking at in the first place. To help us with this process, we will be using a variety of sources, one being Professor Mark Alviz's database of about 1,500 Vietnamese words and their etymological origins. Another source that we will be using is Wiktionary, which has the highest amount of words, although etymologies on that website may not be as well sourced and can be edited by anyone technically. Next, we have Baxter and Sagert's Old Chinese, A New Reconstruction, published by the Oxford University Press. And we also have Schuster's ABC Etymological Dictionary of Old Chinese. Lastly, we have a chữ nôm dictionary known as Tự điển chữ nôm dẫn giải, which was written by Professor Nguyễn Quang Hom of the Institute of Hán Nôm Studies, or Viện Nghiên cứu Hán Nôm in Hanoi. Note that the Điển is the Vietnamese reading of Zhi Dian, while the similarly sounding Từ Điển is the Vietnamese reading of Thư Điển, with the former meaning specifically dictionaries of Han characters, while the latter specifically means dictionaries in a general sense, although the former has been used with the latter meaning to some extent. But anyways, if we look at Yang Yai, it is the Vietnamese reading of Yin Ye, which means annotate or explain in a literary context. With these sources, we will be able to calculate the proportion of Chinese-derived words among the 250 most common Vietnamese terms for each of the 2 corpora. With this video, indeed making the assumption that the more common a word is, the more basic or fundamental that word is, which may not be valid in every possible case, but I do believe that that is generally true. To start off with the results, we will first look at the proportions by corpus. For the children's literature corpus, we have 69 out of 250 for the definitely category, which would be 27.6%. For the open subtitles corpus, it would be 99 out of 250 for 39.6%. Next, for probably, it would be 6 out of 250 for CL, which equals 2.4%, and then 5 divided by 250 for OS, which is 2%. For the possibly category, we have 9 out of 250 for CL, which is 3.6%, then 6 out of 250 for OS, which is 2.4%. Then we have at least one meaning, which for which the proportion is 6 out of 250 for CL, which is 2.4%, and then 6 out of 250 for OS, which is 2.4%. In total, it would be
90 out of 250 for CL, which equals 36%, and then 116 out of 250 for OS, which is 46.4%.
However, if we were to take a point system approach, the estimate would be a bit different. So we first start off with the children's literature corpus, and we estimate that based on the aforementioned point system, we would get around 81.595 points. If we divide that by 250, we get about 32.64%. For the open subtitles corpus, we get about 109.765 points. And if we divide that number by 250, we get around 43.91%. The average of these percentage values would be around 0.38272, so about 38.27%. So to quickly summarize the definitely category, we have the following words: không được bị ông, bà, cô, cậu, bạn thấy như đang nhưng những thì thời vì thật thực cảm ơn chào quá qua thích thương học. So one term that definitely comes from Chinese is actually one that is very, very common, and that is the word "không," which is the Vietnamese reading of the Chinese character "không." And in Mandarin and other modern Chinese dialects, this usually means empty, and this meaning can still be found in Vietnamese, such as the compound word "không khí," which means air, and this would be the cognate of "không chi." But eventually, Vietnamese added the no meaning, which means that it eventually replaced the native negator, which was chẳng, as the main standard negator in Vietnamese. So which and chẳng is still used today, but more in a more literary or emphatic sense. And you look at formal writing or scientific writing, you will really only see không to mean no. Note that some people may ask, oh, well, what about bu? Like that's the main way to say no in Mandarin. What about that word in Vietnamese? Does it have an equivalent in Vietnamese? Well, there is actually the word bắc in Vietnamese, which is actually the reading of that character, bu. So examples of these words would be bắc cẩn, which would be bu bu tin, and this means uncareful. And another example would be Bắc Hiếu, which would be Wu Xiao, or unfilial, or someone who doesn't respect their elders. Another example would be Bắc Khả, which would be Wu Ke. Another would be Bắc Tieng, which would be Wu Bian. And lastly, there would be also Bắc Công, which would be Wu Gong. There are also some more nativized examples, such as Bắc Cứ and Bắc Thần Linh. And I refer to these as nativized because these compounds aren't really found in the other Chinese dialects, and for sure the second term might still come from Chinese, but then the compound itself, the combination, may not be found in Chinese. Next, we have two other characters, or rather two other words, which come from Chinese characters, and those would be được and bei, both of which are very, very common as well in Vietnamese, no matter what register you speak. And được would be the cognate of the, which in Chinese mainly can mean to get or to receive something, and in Vietnamese it does have this meaning, but it also means being able to do something, or being allowed to do something, or something being okay or so. And if we look at wait, which is the negative, which is a more negative passive marker, parallel to how it is a more positive or neutral passive marker. Bei comes from bei, and bei and bei are used very similarly. They're both negative passive markers. Not that another reading of the would be dak, but that's just a fun fact. We also have a set of kinship terms in the Vietnamese that definitely comes from Chinese, and those words would be ông, bà, cô, cậu, and lastly, bạn. with these being the Vietnamese readings of the Chinese characters Wang, Po, Gu, Jiu, and lastly Ban. Note that Bang in Vietnamese means friend, while Ban means companion in Chinese, but they are still relatively similar, although the meanings have slightly diverged. Moreover, the fact that Vietnamese does have these kinship terms from Chinese has been used to support the theory that there used to exist a large Chinese speaking community in northern Vietnam, according to Professor John D. Fan, who calls their dialect Annamese Middle Chinese. And under these conditions, loanwords would be more direct and intimate, so not really, literary formal borrowings. And that would explain why Vietnamese has words like ba, which are very essential in daily life that come from Chinese. We also have the word tai, which means see or feel, and these are perhaps non-Sino Vietnamese readings of either bi or shi. And the reason I say or is because there is dispute over which character is the one that is the source of the word tai. I am more leaning towards the former character, specifically the, because if you hear the Vietnamese pronunciation and then the Cantonese pronunciation, it sounds exactly like the Cantonese or Teochew reading of the first character, which would be. Next, we have a set of words that I like to consider to be more function words.
thấy
The first would be
thấy
như, which would be the Vietnamese reading of ju, and this would be more this would have the meaning of as or like. Next, we have đang, which would be the I would call it the present progressive marker or the indication that you're currently doing something. And this would be the Vietnamese reading of đang. Then we have nhưng and những, which actually come from the same character, interestingly enough. And the reading of this character in general, the Mandarin reading would be yang, which can mean, many or in certain contexts, well, many still yet, although it is a more rare character. And that's why, it is the source of both yang, which is a very formal plural marker, but also nyung, which is a slightly formal way to say but or yet. And it is definitely more common to hear something like ma, or something like that, or nyung ma. But, anyways, we also have te or tai, which are both readings of the character shi. And this character mainly means, time or period of time in Chinese, but has been extended to mean, then in Vietnamese. So, for example, I'm going to say if blah blah blah, then blah blah, it would be now blah blah blah, thì blah blah blah. Finally, well, no, not finally, but almost done. We have we or yi in more southern accents, which would be a way to say because or for something, and this would be the Vietnamese reading of the character wei. Now, truly, finally, for the function words, we have tak and tuk, which mean actual or real or truly, and this has the same meaning as its Chinese counterpart, which would be shi. And note that tuk and tuk are both considered alternative pronunciations of the same character, so that's why I kind of combine them together under the same character. I also want to cover some other words that definitely come from Chinese, and one of these would be, well, technically two of these because it is a compound word, but it would be cảm ơn, and you know, this is a very essential and core compound word in Vietnamese, and people might be surprised to hear that it does come from Chinese, but it is actually the Vietnamese reading of cảm ơn, which has the meaning of grateful in Mandarin, and it has that meaning in Vietnamese too. But you can see how in the past it eventually got extended to having the meaning of thank you in Vietnamese, which does make sense because being grateful for something is connected to someone feeling thankful or someone wishing to say thank you to someone else. And now this next word is perhaps even more common than cảm ơn, and that would be chào. Before I actually taught myself Vietnamese, basically only two terms that I knew growing up in Fit for Vietnamese were cảm ơn and chào. So the fact that chào also comes from Chinese is quite interesting. And you may be wondering though, oh, it doesn't sound anything like ni hao. Well, what do you mean? Well, it comes from the Chinese character which has the Mandarin reading of chao, and this character means has a ton of meanings, but the relevant meaning is that it is the character used to describe when someone greets an official or emperor, and this is only really used in modern Mandarin if you're watching a period piece that's set in the Tang Dynasty, for example, and then you see a character talking about greeting some high level official or emperor, and you'd never hear it in an everyday conversation in probably any modern, well, not even just modern Mandarin, just any modern Chinese dialect. But I could be wrong. But meanwhile, in Vietnamese, it is literally the most common way to say, actually, in fact, really the only way to say hello. You could say xin chào, but that's formal, and also still uses chào in the term. And next we have gua and gua, or wa and wa in more southern accents, but um, these would be the Vietnamese readings of the Chinese character guo, which means to go through or to pass through. It's easy to see where this meaning comes from for gua, because means through something or to go through something. But for gua, we need to understand that that it means something that's so much or too much. So in some way, the hypothesis could be that the sense of going through something could be akin to the sense of exceeding something. And so for that reason, that character got extended to have another meaning in Vietnamese, if that makes sense. We also have words that mean to like or to love in some sense that come from Chinese. And one of these would be "t", which would be the Vietnamese reading of shi. And in Chinese, it has the meaning of something being suitable or to one's liking, but in Vietnamese, this meaning has been extended to mean to like something or someone or some activity in general. And as for thương, it is interesting because in Chinese, this character means wound or injury, but in Vietnamese, it has been extended to mean platonically love, which I've not, I do not really understand how that came about, but that is indeed where the word came from. Finally, we have the word hop, which means to study. Now, this is certainly different from the Mandarin pronunciation of this character, which is shui, but more conservative Chinese dialects like Cantonese, which pronounce the character as, have preserved the same features found in the Vietnamese word. So, in this sense, Vietnamese and the conservative Chinese dialects
học,
have kept these features found in Old/Middle Chinese. In other words, Mandarin is the weird one. So the next section will consist of words that probably come from Chinese. And these would be chú, bác, chúa, khóc, đánh, giống, phải, and lastly, yêu. We'll start with two kinship terms, those being chú and bác, which are probably from shu and bo. Now, the reason that these are probably or not certainly is that, for example, chú has a mid-high rising tone for Vietnamese, but shu does not have the second tone in Mandarin as expected if it were to be a traditional loanword. And for the word back, it could honestly deserve certainly, but it is an aerial word with many different languages in the general vicinity having a history of uh, having this form or one similar in their vocabulary. So it is not clear that it actually originated from Chinese and then went to Vietnamese. Note that "du" can also be a reading of "du", with this meaning certainly being a borrowing from Chinese, with one example of this of a compound with this term being 注意, which would be the Vietnamese reading of 注意, or to pay attention. And the fact that 注 it would be the cognate of 注 in this case does contrast with the fact that the hypothesis that 注, as in the kinship term, comes from 书, because one would expect something like 注, for example. Next, we have 注, which is probably from 注. And if true, it would be the doublet of 九, as in young 九 or 九. But the issue with this word being um, a certain borrowing is that the the tonal correspondence doesn't match. There's no total correspondence, and there's also a weird the final a in the word is a bit odd. Next, we have cop, which is probably from who, and then we also have dan, which is probably from that. But again, for these words, there's a bit of like a deviation from the traditional Sino-Vietnamese correspondences. Now, for this next word, it is not in the top 250 actually, but since it's 252 in Open Subtitles corpus, I saw it as close enough. And that would be the word yom, which means seed or species or breed, or it could be a verb that means to be like or to be like to or to look like. And it is probably from don't, which is a really odd word because odd borrowing because the initial correspondence doesn't match. The initial doesn't match. There's no tonal correspondence. If it were a borrowing from that character, you'd expect it to have either a yo ngã or a yo hỏi, but it doesn't have any of those tones, so that's highly unusual. And furthermore, the meanings, if you look at the meanings of the character, the Chinese character, it does mean seed or species or breed, but it doesn't really have the meaning of to look like, which is how this word in Vietnamese is most used. So you would have to make the argument that that the Vietnamese language added that meaning later, or rather extended the meaning of this word to include that usage, which does provide further uncertainty when it comes to understanding the etymology of this word. Then we have the word Phi, which is probably from Bay, according to Baxter and Sagart. And if this hypothesis were to be true, it would be a doublet of Bei. Now, people may be wondering, oh, how is that even possible? Well, their explanation is that the Chinese character meant have to endure or suffer, which is similar to the meaning that Bei has in Vietnamese. But eventually, there was a shift or an additional meaning of have to and must, which created a shift towards correct, which then created a shift towards right as in direction, given that the right hand or the right direction was associated with correctness. And this is true in other language families like English, for example. So over time, the word "phải" now means have to, correct, and right as in direction. And further evidence for this being a loan word is that there does exist a native word in Vedic languages, but is one that is archaic in Vietnamese. And that word is dam, which is used in phrases like "chừng đâm đá, chừng chiu," which describes someone who's extremely drunk, that like one of their legs is kicking the other leg. And lastly, for this category, we have "ew," which is probably from either yao or yao. Now, the thing is that for the first character, yao, which means to want something, it doesn't mean exactly the same as to love something, so it would have to be a meaning shift, and also the tones don't really match. And for the word yao, it does mean pretty and beautiful, but again, that would be have to be a shift towards a uh, more of a verb. And the tones do match, but it's just that there isn't there's a lot of uncertainty because it may have come from, maybe a loan from Old Chinese. Afterwards, we have the words that possibly come from Chinese, and these words are ta, lại, bé, cái, biết, tiếng, giờ, chồng, and xa. And this word was put in the possibly category because there are so many different hypotheses and different words from which it originated. And one of them is actually that it came from the Austronesian language family, which is based on the fact that it is very similar to the first person inclusive plural pronouns of various Austronesian languages like Samoan or Malay, and there is a history of Austronesian peoples being in Vietnam, specifically the Cham people in parts of central Vietnam and south central Vietnam. Another possibility is that it comes from the Chinese character Zan. The the correspondences would be highly irregular, and the only thing that this character has going for it, I suppose, is that it has a similar meaning. There's also the possibility that it comes from the character ta, which has the shared meaning of being used for third person pronouns, but it lacks the initial correspondence, and it should be in Vietnamese ta instead of ta. Next, we have the word lại, which is possibly related to the Chinese character lai, according to Mark Alves and also Baxter and Sager. The problem with this, with the certainty of this being an actual borrowing, is that the borrowing would be extremely irregular, as in the form of the word would be extremely irregular, and the character only has one of the many meanings that this Vietnamese word has. In Mandarin and other Chinese dialects, it really only means to come or to arrive. And while that is one of the meanings of the word in Vietnamese, it also has a lot more, like once, like again, once more, or returning to original state. Um, and part of those can be seen as extensions of the the come or arrive meaning, but regardless, it is still somewhat tenuous to make a certain claim regarding this word. Then we have the word "bé," which is possibly native according to Alves, or from the Chinese character "bi," which is a literary word that means something that's like low level or short in stature, which makes sense because "em bé" would be a baby in Vietnamese. And there is tonal correspondence and initial correspondence, but again, this is probably a loan from an old Chinese context. So yeah, moving on, we would have the word "gai," which is possibly native, due to the fact that there are possible cognates in languages within the Austroasiatic family, or it could be related to the Chinese character "ge," according to Mark Alves's, and "ge" is usually used to denote a certain. It really means like a single thing or object. And then we have the word "bia," which is possibly native according to Mark Alves, but it also could be related to "bia." So ultimately, "bia," according to other linguists, this would be irregular, but it would be a doublet to "bia," and their forms are pretty similar, so there is a possibility here. And it is worth mentioning that in some philosophical worldviews, like Moism, the ability to distinguish is equivalent to knowledge. So it's not too far fetched um, to see that the word or action of distinguishing two things can be extended to be the action of knowing a thing. Afterwards, we have the word "ting," which is possibly from Sheng, according to Mark Alves. The tone of the word having yoshak is unexpected, and given that there's no tonal correspondence, it does limit the certainty of this being a loan word. And if it were, though, it would be a doublet of the word tan, which is the word that is definitely from Chinese. Afterwards, we have the word Yeah, which is possibly related to shi. So in that case, it would be a doublet of tui and tai. And it is somewhat similar to the reconstructions of the Old Chinese form of that character, but it's still very irregular. There's also the possibility that the Vietnamese word as in husband, is possibly from the Chinese character zhang, according to Mark Alves. Indeed, zhang can be used in zhang fu, which means husband. There is a lack of tonal correspondence, but everything else checks out, specifically the initial and final. So there is a possibility that this word is indeed a borrowing. And lastly, for this category, there's the word sa, which is possibly from the Chinese character she. It is considered native by Mark Alves, but it does have a similarity to the above character. And there also exists a native word, which is ngai for Vietnamese. And this word is considered somewhat archaic, and nowadays it's really only used in parts of central Vietnam. And even so, it's mainly used as a compound along with sa, so it would be sa ngai. So of course, we have the final category, which are words that have at least one meaning come from Chinese. And the words in this category are chú, chỉ, bao, đồ, đom, bang, bắn, and lastly, đường. We've already discussed chú, which can mean both uncle and to pour/pay attention in some sense. And now we will discuss chỉ, which has five somewhat common meanings. The native meaning would be thread, as in chỉ nha khoa, but it's for other meanings or for other common meanings would be from Chinese. So chỉ as in only or just something would be from um, the meaning of chỉ as in to point at something would be from um, the meaning of halt as in đình chỉ or cấm chỉ would be from and lastly the location meaning as in địa chỉ would be from then we have bao, which has two meanings, one of which is native, and it's the one that relates to quantity, as in bao sa, bao lao, or bao nhiêu. But its bag wrap meaning is from bao. So the meaning as in stuff or thing is native, but the use of the word in personal insults is from tu, while the map meaning is from tu. So for example, bản đồ would be bản thủ. We also have the word which has three meanings. It could be field, which is possibly from a Thai language, as in the sub-branch subfamily of the Kradai language family. They also kind of have the meaning of same as a sort of a prefix, which comes from tong, and it also has the meaning of money, which comes from the Chinese character tong, uh, that means copper in Chinese. We also have the word dang, which could have the meaning of group, flock, or herd, which is native, but it could also have the meaning of musical instrument. And this actually comes from the Chinese character tan, and this character does have multiple meanings, but one of its meanings is to play a musical instrument. Then we have ban, which has two common meanings. The wheel meaning is native, but the food meaning is actually possibly from ping, which also means kind of biscuit or bread in Chinese. And there is a lack of proper correspondence, so it is only a possibility and not a certainty. And also, ban can describe so many different types of foods that it is kind of difficult to come up with a proper definition of ban. So that even adds to the uncertainty over the etymology of this word. And lastly, we have đường, and the Sugar meaning definitely comes from tang, the Chinese character tang, but the road meaning is unclear because it may be native depending on where the Chinese character tang comes from, given that it may ultimately be from Proto-Austroasiatic, according to Schlusser 2007, specifically his ABC Etymological Dictionary of Old Chinese. So it is possible that this word for path or road and a character that is the name of arguably the most famous Chinese dynasty, besides perhaps the Han Dynasty, and I am referring to the Tang Dynasty, had its name come from an ancestor of the Vietnamese language. Referring to the Tang Dynasty, had its name come from an ancestor of the Vietnamese language. I wanted to use this word Leung to segue into a different subset of Vietnamese. And by that I mean words which are borrowings from Chinese, but ultimately come from the ancestor language of Vietnamese. So, what do I mean by that? I mean that the word is its most recent transfer stage, I suppose you could call it that. There's a more formal linguistic term, but I'm drawing a blank here. Um, it ultimately directly comes from Chinese in its recent transfer, but in the past, Chinese itself borrowed the language from the ancestor language of Vietnamese, which would be Proto-Austroasiatic. So one further example of such a word, in addition to Duong, would be the word Jade. And this word can mean, elder sister or a pronoun used with young or relatively young women who are slightly older than you. Um, but it comes from the Chinese character "ye" or "zi." However, in the past, according to Schlusser 2007's ABC Etymological Dictionary of Old Chinese actually borrowed this word from Proto-Austroasiatic. Similarly, the word "ho," which is "hu" in Mandarin, and probably similar in other Chinese dialects, is a are cognates in the sense that Ho'o was borrowed directly from Chinese through this character, but the character itself, or rather the word that the character represents, is ultimately from Proto-Austroasiatic as well. And it would be a doublet of Kai in Vietnamese, which means tiger in certain north central Vietnamese dialects. And this is based on Norman and May's paper from 1976.
And last, but definitely not least, we have a word that has been used throughout this entire video, and that is the word "việc." Technically, the Vietnamese word is, in its most recent transfer, so to speak, a direct borrowing from the Chinese character yue. But where did Chinese get this character from? In the sense of referring to the entire ethnic group, given that the character does have multiple meanings, which are probably native for Chinese, Schlusser 2007 notes that this character usage most likely came from the character yue, which refers to the ancient battle axe used in ancient China. And based on linguistic and archaeological evidence, the weapon and the term for the weapon itself may have originated from either Austronesian populations or Austroasiatic groups living in what is now modern day southeastern China.
In conclusion, based on the frequency lists above and their etymologies, it is fair to assume that roughly 35 to 40% of common Vietnamese vocabulary is borrowed from Chinese. So the majority of common Vietnamese words are still of native origin, but a meaningful chunk still does originate from Chinese. One caveat, of course, of this whole project is that these are both corpora based on written texts, with the children's literature corpus being based on, well, children's literature, and the open subtitles corpus being based on movies and films uh, with their respective subtitles. And these are not transcriptions of verbal conversations, which may be a better reflection of the common register of Vietnamese, given that most people use the language when speaking to others. And that being said, though, The children's literature corpus may be a better reflection of everyday language because open subtitles covers the language used in movies and films, which are often more dramatic and fictional, while children's literature is still fictional, of course, but it is simplified given that it is for children. Therefore, I would give more weight to the lower estimate of the children's literature corpus, meaning that I would generally say that approximately 35% of common Vietnamese vocabulary is from Chinese, which is still a very high amount, of course, but it is the lower end of my final interval estimate. Note that the children's literature corpus includes more animal names such as rabbit or bear, and specific fictional pronouns which aren't used in real life, like the animal names, were removed, specifically Nang and Jang. And these are, like I said, only used in fiction, unlike the other words. Another caveat of this video is that I did not cover all the terms and their etymologies. Know that they are all honestly pretty interesting. I just chose the ones that I saw as the most surprising or intriguing due to time limitations. So to give you all a chance to see all the words in their etymologies, I will share two Google Docs, one for each corpus, in the description, and these documents will list out all the words with their respective assigned category. Thank you for watching to the end of this video. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again for my next video. Take care.